we're going to discuss receptors and intracellular signaling, and it would be a series of videos. We would cover different types of receptors and how they function. So we know that receptors are present all over the body, and they basically play a role in communication between different cells. So what do you mean by receptors? Biologically defining, these are basically macromolecules, or we can more precisely to say, basically this is a class of proteins that perform their function by binding ligands. And when these ligands bind to the receptors, they basically generate a signal that is transmitted to inside of cell, consequently resulting in biological modification. So what are ligands basically? Ligand is basically any kind of molecule that binds to receptor and one condition for a molecule to be ligand is that when bind to receptor, it should bring change in the biological modification, or it should modify the receptor as to transmit some kind of signal inside the cell. So for example, here we have a receptor, and here we have our receptor, and this is ligand, and the site where the ligand binds to the receptor is known as ligand binding domain. And suppose this is a transmembrane receptor, and so one of its part will be present inside the cell. Here is our receptor, one part of it is present outside the cell, and outside the cell the ligand will bind, and we call it as ligand binding domain. Another part is inside the cell, and through which it will send signal to the inside cell, and this is known as basically effector domain. Okay, so this was very brief overview of receptor. Now we discuss that what kind of molecule can act as ligand. So basically all neurotransmitters, hormones, toxins, drug molecules, or any chemical substances that are able to bring change by binding to the receptor, they all act as ligands. Okay, now we discuss that basically where the receptors are present. Receptors are basically can be present on the plasma membrane, basically which are transmembrane receptor, or these can be present inside the cell. So where the receptor is present depends upon which type of ligands are binding to them. So for example, we have a ligand that is very large, high molecular weight, and that molecule is also charged, very low lipid solubility. So we know that this kind of molecule cannot pass through a lipid bilayer of plasma membrane. So we have a ligand that has high molecular weight, or maybe it is polar, or maybe its size is very large. So we know that or maybe it has low lipid solubility. So all these attributes make this molecule difficult to pass through the plasma membrane, which is lipid bilayer. So their receptors will be present on the surface of plasma membrane, so they don't have to pass through the plasma membrane. So they will be acting on the transmembrane receptors. So example of such kind of receptors that are present on the cell surface is Catecholamines that are very important, which include we have catecholamines or peptide hormones, receptors of peptide hormones, peptide and growth hormones, etc. Now we have another type of ligand, basically that have low molecular weight, that are non-polar, which means they are not charged, neutral molecules. Their size isn't very large, they are small sized, and they are lipid soluble. So these attributes make them make easy for them to pass through the plasma membrane, which is lipid bilayer, and so their receptors are present inside the cell. So these can be present in the nucleus. So these receptors are present inside the cell. So any compound that is basically a derivative of cholesterol, they can easily pass through the plasma membrane. Or we have thyroid hormones also, which include T3 and T4, or vitamin A related compounds, also known as retinoids. And we have this testosterone, steroid hormones, all steroid hormones, which are basically the derivatives of cholesterol. They can pass easily through the plasma membrane, so their receptors are present inside the cell. We can write here as steroid hormones.